The night was sharp, electric, filled with promises of change. Ji-eun stood behind the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she wiped down the cafe table. The warmth of the cafe couldn't protect her from the cold reality of what was happening outside. Her past had a way of haunting her in the most inconvenient ways, and tonight, she would confront it. Seung-ho's voice echoed in her memory, cutting through the noise of her thoughts. "You'll never be anything without me." His words felt like a permanent scar on her soul. As much as she tried to move on, his contempt lingered like a shadow, never quite leaving. And then, there he was. She had no idea it was him at first. The man who would change everything, the man who had the power to burn everything down and rebuild it from the ashes. And he stepped into the cafe like a king entering his kingdom, and suddenly, everything around her seemed insignificant. Seung-ho noticed him immediately, and the confidence that usually radiated from him faltered for just a second. There was something about the stranger, something dangerous, magnetic, something that made Ji-eun's heart race. Who was he? And why was he looking at her like that? Ji-eun had never been special. At least, that's what she had believed for most of her life. Raised in a quiet neighborhood in Seoul, she grew up with dreams that always seemed too big for her humble circumstances. She wasn't born into wealth or power, and that fact always felt like a weight around her neck. Her ex, Seung-ho, had been her world once. He was everything Ji-eun wasn't. Born into a family of influential business people, Seung-ho was confident, handsome, and most importantly, connected. His arrogance was almost as charming as it was frustrating. From the very beginning, he told her she was lucky to be with him, and she believed it. He treated her like an accessory, a trophy to be flaunted and discarded at will. But what hurt the most wasn't the cheating or the lies. It was the constant belittling. Seung-ho always told her that she was nothing without him. When he left her, it was like a final stamp on her worthlessness. It wasn't just a breakup. It was a declaration. To everyone around her, it was clear. She was nothing without him. After their breakup, Ji-eun tried to move on, but the whispers never stopped. In every cafe, in every restaurant, there were people who knew about Seung-ho's rise to power in the underworld. And he was now connected to the Korean Mafia, an untouchable figure in the criminal empire. His name carried weight, and with it, everyone who had ever been connected to him, like Ji-eun, felt the pressure. She worked long hours at a small cafe, serving drinks and clearing tables. But every now and then, someone would mention Seung-ho, and the familiar ache would return. It was the same story over and over again. "Seung-ho is doing so well now, you know. He's a big shot. Too bad Ji-eun couldn't keep up." The weight of those words was like a constant reminder. She wasn't good enough. She wasn't enough to keep him, and she wasn't enough to have anything of her own. She wasn't enough. On a quiet evening, the cafe was nearly empty, just a few customers scattered around the room. Ji-eun was lost in her thoughts as she worked, and the low hum of the music blending with the soft clink of mugs and glasses. She didn't notice Seung-ho walk in at first, but she certainly felt his presence when he came to sit at the counter. His laugh echoed too loudly, his eyes glinting with that arrogant edge she remembered so well. "Still working here?" he sneered, making sure the entire room could hear. "Guess some people never change." His friends snickered in the background. Ji-eun stood frozen for a moment, forced to hold the smile that was so familiar, the smile she had perfected over the years. "What can I get you, Seung-ho?" she asked quietly, her voice steady but betraying the tremor in her hands. "Just some coffee," he said, tossing a bill down on the counter like it was beneath him to make the exchange. He looked her up and down, a smirk playing on his lips. Still the same, uh-huh. Working this dead-end job while I'm making deals with the big players? His friends laughed again. The sound stung. Ji-un quickly turned around to prepare his order, but the sting didn't fade. It was like that familiar feeling, the one she'd tried so hard to bury, was creeping back into her chest, suffocating her. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, judging her silently, whispering about how she was nothing but a shadow of Sung-ho's past. That was when the door swung open. A man stepped inside, and everything about the room shifted. The man who entered the cafe had an air about him, an aura of danger and power. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room. His presence was magnetic. The moment he entered, all eyes turned toward him. Ji-un caught his gaze by accident, and for a split second, she felt like the world had stopped spinning. The stranger's eyes locked with hers, and in them, she saw something that she hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition. It was brief, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. She was lost in the moment when Sung-ho's voice broke her focus. "Who the hell is that?" Sung-ho's voice was low, but Ji-un could hear the unease in it. He noticed the way the stranger was looking at her, and for the first time, Seung-ho's arrogance faltered. The man approached, his steps confident, calculated. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, like a blade just waiting to be drawn. Seung-ho stiffened. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The stranger didn't seem to care. "I'm not worried about her," he said, motioning to Ji-un. But you, Seung-ho." "Well, I think you've been treating her like she's nothing." The room went silent. This was no ordinary man. His presence alone was enough to make everyone hold their breath. But Ji-un couldn't understand. Who was he? And why did he look at her like that? The silence that followed the stranger's words felt suffocating. Sung-ho, who was once so brimming with confidence, seemed to shrink in the presence of this man. His eyes darted from the stranger to Ji-un, and then to his friends, who looked just as confused as he did. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Seung-ho finally managed to spit out, his voice shaky despite his efforts to sound intimidating. The stranger smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was one that carried power, a confidence that made everyone else in the room feel small. He wasn't backing down. And in fact, it almost seemed like he was toying with Sung-ho. "I'm someone who knows what real power looks like," the stranger replied smoothly. "I don't need to prove anything to you, Sung-ho." Sung-ho clenched his fists, his pride taking over. "I don't need anyone's help, especially not yours." His tone was desperate, trying to regain some sense of control. But the stranger wasn't interested in playing Sung-ho's games. He turned to Ji-un, who had been frozen in place, watching this strange confrontation unfold. The man's eyes softened as they met hers once more, and there was an unspoken understanding in his gaze. For a fleeting moment, Ji-un felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. "I know you've been through a lot," the man said gently, though everyone in the room could hear him. But they don't get to tell you who you are." Seung-ho's face twisted in anger. "What is this? Some kind of pity show?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and spoke calmly into the receiver. "I need a favor. No questions asked. Meet me at the cafe in 10 minutes. The tension in the room thickened, and Ji-un could feel her pulse quicken. The stranger's presence was unnerving, but it was also oddly comforting. What was he about to do? Why was he standing up for her? She barely knew him, yet somehow, in this moment, he made her feel like she wasn't invisible. Sung-ho, trying to save face, stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process. "This is ridiculous. You've got nothing on me." His bravado was just a mask, and everyone could see it. The stranger didn't react to Seung-ho's outburst, and he simply turned his attention back to Ji-eun, who had been holding herself together as best as she could. There was something about this man that made her feel like she was no longer the weak woman Seung-ho had once reduced her to. "You're not what they say you are," the man said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're so much more." Ji-eun swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to break free. She had spent so long believing Seung-ho's lies, believing that she was nothing. But this man, this stranger who had just walked into her life, was making her question everything. As Seung-ho's frustration grew, he looked around the cafe. His friends had begun to whisper among themselves, their curiosity piqued. But Seung-ho wasn't the type to back down easily, especially not in front of his friends. But he had too much pride. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat. The man finally looked at Seung-ho, his gaze cold and unwavering. "I don't care who you are, but you will learn what happens when you cross the wrong person." Seung-ho blinked, taken aback by the stranger's unyielding confidence. The air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Ji-eun could feel the tension building as the stranger's power radiated through the room. It wasn't long before the first of Kwon Jae-hyun's men arrived. 3 men, all dressed in dark suits, walked into the cafe with an air of intimidation. Their mere presence made everyone in the room fall silent. These weren't ordinary people. They moved with precision, like they were soldiers under command, and their eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. And Seung-ho's face drained of color as he saw them approach, his bravado faltering even further. He took a step back, his gaze shifting to Ji-eun in disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath. Kwon Jae-hyun didn't bother answering. He simply turned to the men, who immediately went to work. They approached Seung-ho's table with an air of authority, and without a word, they began to remove the drinks and dishes in front of Seung-ho and his friends. Seung-ho watched in stunned silence. As his friends were also ushered out of the cafe, not a single protest allowed. The power of Kwon's men was palpable, and even Seung-ho, with all his connections, couldn't do anything but watch. Finally, Kwon turned back to Ji-eun, his expression softening. "It's time you stopped letting them control your story." Ji-eun stood there, processing everything that was happening. This man, Kwon Jae-hyun, had just single-handedly dismantled Seung-ho's world, and Ji-eun wasn't sure how to feel about it. Seung-ho's voice broke through her thoughts. You can't do this," he said, his voice shaking with panic now. "I'll ruin you. I have the power." "You had the power," Kwon interrupted him coldly, his voice cutting through Seung-ho's threats like a knife. "Now you have nothing." Seung-ho's face was twisted with rage and fear. "I don't care who you are." Kwon's men moved in closer, positioning themselves between Seung-ho and the exit. The tension in the room was unbearable as Seung-ho realized just how deep the hole he had dug for himself was. Kwon Jae-hyun wasn't just a businessman. He was someone who could destroy everything Seung-ho had worked for. And it was all about to come crashing down. Ji-eun watched the scene unfold, her mind racing. She had always been the one to step aside, to let others control her life. But tonight, she was witnessing something she had never thought possible: revenge, justice, and the realization that she wasn't invisible. Kwon Jae-hyun was showing her that she could stand tall, that she didn't have to shrink away any longer. Kwon's gaze met hers once more, and for the first time in a long time, Ji-eun felt like someone saw her, really saw her. She wasn't nothing, she wasn't weak. She was more than Sung-ho's taunts and manipulations. She had value. "You're free now," Kwon said quietly, his words directed only at her. "Free to be who you were always meant to be." Her heart swelled with emotion, and Ji-yeon knew in that moment that everything was about to change. The cafe had become eerily quiet, almost as if the world itself had paused to witness what was unfolding. Sung-ho, who had once been the center of attention in any room he entered, now stood at the edge of his empire, watching it all crumble before his eyes. His friends had long since been ushered out, leaving only him, Ji-yoon, and Kwon Jae-hyun. The stillness between them was palpable. Ji-yoon stood frozen, trying to process everything that had happened in the last half hour. It felt like a dream, too surreal, too impossible. But the power in the room, the absolute control that Kwon Jae-hyun held over the situation, told her this wasn't a dream. Kwon Jae-hyun leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed, but still radiating an undeniable authority. He didn't speak, but the silence itself seemed to demand respect. Ji-yeon couldn't help but steal glances at him, trying to piece together who he really was, what he really wanted from her, and why he had come to her rescue. Sung-ho shifted uneasily. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over everything?" he sneered, trying to reclaim some of his former arrogance, but it rang hollow now. "You don't know who I am. You don't know what I'm capable of." Kwon didn't respond right away. He simply turned his head slightly, his gaze never leaving Ji-yoon. There was something about the way he looked at her, a quiet understanding that went beyond words. She hadn't known him long, but in that moment, she felt a strange connection to him. Finally, Kwon spoke, his voice calm, but filled with conviction. "I know exactly who you are, Sung-ho, and I know everything about you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sung-ho looked like he had been slapped. "What do you mean by that?" he demanded, his voice shaking with uncertainty. Kwon Jae-hyun's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no humor in it, just cold, unrelenting power. He straightened up, walking toward Sung-ho slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. "My name is Kwon Jae-hyun," he began, his voice low and unyielding. "And I don't just know who you are. I know what you've done, and I know the lies you've been telling everyone. You think you're untouchable. You think you're the one who holds the cards. But you're wrong." Sung-ho's eyes widened in disbelief, a flicker of fear starting to creep into his expression. You're the head of the Jae-hyun group, aren't you?" he stammered. Kwon nodded, his smile deepening as if the recognition was the first step toward sealing Sung-ho's fate. "Yes, that's right. The Jae-hyun group, the most powerful criminal syndicate in Seoul, maybe even in all of Asia. But that's not what matters right now." Sung-ho's confusion grew. "I've heard of you, of course," he muttered, trying to regain his composure. "But what does that have to do with me?" Kwon's expression turned icy. "Everything," he said coldly, "because your actions have consequences, and you, Seung-ho, you crossed a line." For a moment, Seung-ho just stood there, his bravado slipping away piece by piece. His face turned a shade of pale as he realized the gravity of the situation. He tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but the air felt thick with dread. "I've never been afraid of anyone," Sung-ho said, and though his voice lacked conviction now. "Not even you." Kwon's men, who had been standing quietly in the background, took a step forward. The simple movement sent a clear message. Sung-ho had no place to run, no way to escape what was coming. "You should be," Kwon replied flatly. Ji-yeon felt like an outsider in her own life, watching these two men clash as though she wasn't even in the room. But that's when Kwon Jae-hyun turned his attention back to her, his gaze softening. It was almost as if the entire situation faded into the background as he spoke to her, his words directed solely at her. "Ji-eun," he said, his voice gentle but filled with an unspoken weight. "You've always been more than what they made you believe. You're not just some woman who got caught in the wrong crowd. You're a part of something much bigger than this." Ji-eun's mind raced. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Kwon stepped closer, his presence undeniable. "You think Seung-ho was the one who had the power here, but he wasn't. It was always you, Ji-eun. You were always meant for something greater." Her confusion deepened. "What are you saying? I don't—" Kwon took a deep breath, and the tension in the room seemed to shift. "Do you remember your father, Ji-eun? He wasn't just a simple businessman. He was one of my closest allies. He was a key player in the Jae-hyun group. He was a man of power. And you're his daughter." The words hit Ji-eun like a freight train. Her father? A member of the Mafia? She had spent her entire life believing that he was a simple, ordinary man, someone who worked hard to provide for their family. But now, in the space of a few seconds, Kwon had shattered her entire understanding of who she was. Seung-ho, meanwhile, seemed to have been struck dumb. What do you mean?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She's just a girl who used to work at my cafe. What does her father have to do with this?" Kwon's eyes never left Ji-eun. "Your father was the one who helped me build this empire. When he died, he left behind a legacy, and he left behind you. You're his daughter, Ji-eun. You've been a part of this world since the day you were born, whether you knew it or not." For a moment, all Ji-eun could do was stand there, frozen, her mind scrambling to process what Kwon had just said. Her father wasn't who she thought he was. He had been connected to this dangerous underworld. And now, here she was, standing in the very heart of it. And Seung-ho's arrogance had completely crumbled by this point. He was no longer the cocky, self-assured man who had walked into the cafe just an hour ago. Now, he looked like a cornered animal, his mind racing for an escape, any escape, from the situation he found himself in. "No," he muttered, shaking his head as if denying Kwon's words could somehow erase them. "This isn't possible. She's just a waitress. She doesn't belong in your world." Kwon's gaze remained unwavering. "She's not just a waitress. She's the heir to a legacy you could never even dream of." Seung-ho looked to the men in the room, his eyes wild. "You don't know who you're messing with," he shouted. "I have people who will—" But before he could finish, Kwon snapped his fingers. One of his men stepped forward, their movements swift and coordinated. Within seconds, Seung-ho found himself surrounded, his threats turning to empty words. He was utterly powerless. "Enough," Kwon said quietly, but his voice held the weight of 1,000 judgments. "Your time has run out." Ji-eun's head was spinning. The revelation about her father had rocked her to her core. Everything she had believed about her life, about her family, had been a lie. But in the midst of all the chaos, something began to stir within her, a sense of power, of identity. She wasn't nothing. She never was. She turned to Kwon, meeting his gaze with newfound clarity. "What now?" she asked softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Kwon smiled, the weight of everything he had revealed now settling into the room. "Now, Ji-eun. Now, you get to decide who you truly are." Seung-ho stood in the middle of the cafe, his back against the wall. At the realization of his impending downfall settling in, his once confident demeanor was gone, replaced by desperation. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he tried to backpedal, attempting to salvage whatever remained of his crumbling empire. "You can't just do this," he said, his voice trembling, yet still tinged with defiance. "I've done everything right. I'm connected. I'm important. You can't take everything from me. You can't destroy everything I've built." Kwon Jae-hyun, standing across the room, watched him with a calm that contrasted with Seung-ho's panic. The power in Kwon's eyes was absolute, unshakable. "You never understood what real power was," Kwon said softly, his words sharp and final. "It wasn't your money, it wasn't your connections, it was always about respect. And you lost that the moment you treated Ji-eun like she was nothing." Seung-ho's eyes darted around the room, his mind racing for an escape. But the cold, calculating men that Kwon had surrounded him with stood like statues, unwavering and still. There was nowhere to run. Kwon's gaze shifted to Ji-eun, his eyes softening just slightly. "You've been underestimated for far too long, Ji-eun. I think it's time to show them who you really are." Ji-eun's heart was pounding in her chest, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from the rush of knowing that she was no longer a passive observer in her life. She had been given an opportunity, one she never imagined she would have, and she wasn't going to waste it. Seung-ho's defiance had finally shattered, and now it was Ji-eun's turn to step into the light. For so long, she had lived in the shadows, trying to convince herself that she was just an ordinary woman, that her worth had been defined by the people around her. But now, as Kwon stood beside her, his unwavering confidence a steady foundation, Ji-eun realized that her destiny was her own to claim. She walked slowly toward Seung-ho, her footsteps deliberate and strong. The room seemed to grow quieter with every step she took. Seung-ho's eyes were wide with fear, his back pressed firmly against the wall as if trying to make himself invisible. Seung-ho started to say, but Ji-eun cut him off. "You don't get to speak," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. The power in her tone shocked even her. "You lost your right to speak when you treated me like I was nothing." Seung-ho opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. And the arrogance that had once filled his every movement was gone, replaced by a pitiful desperation. He tried to look to Kwon for help, but the man merely stared at him with indifference. "I spent so many years believing your lies," Ji-eun continued, her voice rising with emotion. "But I'm done. I don't need you. I don't need your approval. I never did." Seung-ho's eyes flickered with disbelief. He had always been the one who controlled the narrative. He had always been the one who made the rules. And now, it was slipping through his fingers like sand. Kwon took a step closer to Ji-eun, his presence towering beside her. "You've been strong, Ji-eun. Stronger than you realized. The time for you to claim your legacy has come." Seung-ho's world had collapsed. The men who had once been his loyal followers now turned their backs on him, and as if they too recognized his weakness. He was alone, surrounded by the people he had once lorded over. The humiliation was unbearable. "What do you want from me?" Seung-ho spat, his voice raw with anger and desperation. "You've taken everything from me. My money? My connections? What more do you want?" Kwon's voice was cold, his eyes never leaving Seung-ho. "I want you to understand that you're not untouchable. You never were. You used people for your own gain, trampled on anyone who got in your way. But you crossed a line when you tried to destroy her. And now, you will pay the price." The men who had been standing in the background moved forward again, surrounding Seung-ho. He had nowhere to run. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time in a long time, he felt small. He was just a man, powerless against the forces that had come for him. Ji-eun didn't watch the final moments of Seung-ho's downfall. She didn't need to. She had already made her decision. The closure she needed wasn't found in his punishment. It was found in the strength she had discovered within herself. Kwon Jae-hyun watched silently as the final consequences of Seung-ho's actions unfolded. The man who had once been a threat to Ji-eun's happiness was now nothing more than a shadow of his former self. The justice was swift, and it was just. Seung-ho had been reduced to nothing. Ji-eun turned to face Kwon, her heart pounding with a mix of emotions. "Is it over?" she asked softly, her voice betraying a hint of vulnerability. Kwon nodded, his expression unreadable. "It is. You're free now, Ji-eun, free to live your life on your terms." Ji-eun couldn't believe it. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her past finally lifting. The chains that Seung-ho had placed around her had been shattered, and she was standing in a world where she was no longer invisible. The sense of freedom was overwhelming. As the days passed, Ji-eun began to rebuild her life. She left the cafe behind, no longer bound by the constraints of her past. She moved into a new apartment, one that felt like a fresh start. Her confidence grew with each passing day, and slowly but surely, she began to embrace the woman she had always been, strong, capable, and deserving of everything life had to offer. But even as her life transformed, there was one thing that remained constant: Kwon Jae-hyun. Over time, Ji-eun and Kwon developed a bond, one forged in shared understanding and mutual respect. Kwon never pushed her into a world she wasn't ready for. Instead, he allowed her to choose her own path, to decide what kind of life she wanted to live. And in the quiet moments when she reflected on the events that had led her here, Ji-eun knew one thing for certain. She had found her strength not through revenge, but through self-discovery. She had taken control of her own story, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. One evening, as Ji-eun sat in her new apartment, looking out over the city she had once felt disconnected from, she received a message from Kwon. It was simple, just a few words. "You're ready now. Go make your mark." Ji-eun smiled to herself, her heart swelling with pride. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she first stepped into that cafe. She had been given a chance, not just by Kwon, but by herself. And now, it was time for her to write the next chapter of her life, one where she was the heroine of her own story. She wasn't just the daughter of a powerful man. She wasn't just the woman Seung-ho had dismissed. She was Ji-eun, and she was unstoppable. The story of Ji-eun had come full circle, from a woman who was invisible, defined by the men around her, to a powerful force in her own right. She had transformed. The Korean Mafia boss, Kwon Jae-hyun, had played a pivotal role in her journey, but it was Ji-eun who had taken the reins of her own fate. And now, with the past behind her, she stepped forward into a future full of possibilities. The weight of Seung-ho's cruelty and her own insecurities had lifted. Ji-eun was ready to become the woman she had always been meant to be. The world was hers for the taking.